Imagine a company so powerful, it controls the cooking oil, the bread, and even the prices you pay at the store. You know names like Walmart, Amazon, and Nestle. But there's one company most people have never heard of. ADM behind the scenes. They're making billions while quietly controlling the food you eat. Caught in massive scandals involving corruption and price fixing, slave labor. ADM should have fallen. But instead, they keep getting bigger. This is the real story of ADM, a ruthless empire built on greed, betrayal, and power.
ADM started back in 1902 as Archer Daniels Midland, a small grain processing company. At the time, it was just one of many trying to make a mark in agriculture.
But ADM was different. They had bigger ambitions. While many companies focused only on trading or processing, ADM aimed to control every step of the supply chain. Over the decades, they steadily expanded beyond grain processing into oils, sweeteners, and a wide range of other food products. By the mid-20th century, ADM had grown into a giant in agricultural commodities, shaping how food was produced and distributed worldwide. This wasn't just about growing bigger, it was about becoming indispensable. ADM strategically acquired other companies, bought up suppliers, and vertically integrated their operations. They transformed from a simple grain processor to a powerhouse controlling much of the food production pipeline. Wasn't random. ADM's leadership had a clear vision: to dominate the global food market. This meant controlling production, influencing prices, and deciding availability worldwide. By owning everything from farms to factories to grocery store shelves. This aggressive growth helped them survive economic downturns and food crises, but it also gave them immense power. Farmers, food companies, and even governments came to depend on ADM's vast infrastructure and reach. And with that power came the ability to shape markets and policies in ways that suited their interests, often at the expense of others. Aggressive growth wasn't just about survival, it was about dominance. While other companies scrambled to navigate the ups and downs of economic downturns, global recessions, and food crises, ADM used those very crises as opportunities. Every drought, every trade embargo, every market collapse became a chance for ADM to tighten its grip. When smaller competitors failed or governments lost control over food prices, and over time, this strategy made them indispensable. Farmers, food companies, and even entire governments found themselves relying on ADM's vast infrastructure to keep their economies moving. People fed from massive grain silos towering over rural America to sprawling processing plants in South America and shipping routes stretching across the Atlantic and Pacific. ADM controlled the arteries of the global food supply. But with that power came something even more dangerous: the ability to shape markets and policies in ways that served their own interests. This wasn't about competition anymore, it was about control. ADM could flood markets with cheap commodities to crush rivals, or hold back shipments to drive prices up when it suited them. They had the leverage to dictate terms to governments threatening to pull out of region or disrupt supply chains if policies weren't favorable. Lawmakers often faced a difficult choice: either play by ADM's rules or risk destabilizing their own food systems. And because ADM operated in so many sectors, from beyond groceries, they weren't just shaping what people ate, they were shaping what countries traded and taxed. The reach was staggering. A decision made in a boardroom at ADM's headquarters in Chicago could ripple across continents, affecting grain prices in Argentina, oil production in Indonesia, and food shortages in Africa, leaving the household brand names to take the spotlight while they quietly pulled the strings in the background. But ADM's story doesn't stop at aggressive expansion. What they did next crossed a line no one expected. ADM's rise wasn't a story of fair play. Their growth was fueled by ruthless tactics and an insatiable hunger for control. ADM didn't just grow by meeting demand, they grew by manipulating markets. One of their most notorious strategies was price manipulation. Using their vast market power, ADM influenced key commodity prices, squeezing farmers and competitors in the process. They built monopolies that allowed them to corner the market, pushing out smaller players who couldn't compete. They built monopolies that allowed them to corner the market, pushing out smaller players who couldn't compete. By hoarding supplies or flooding markets at strategic times, ADM ensured they always stayed on top. But their greed went beyond market manipulation. Reports surfaced that ADM relied on exploitative labor to keep costs low, using forced labor and even child labor in their supply chains, especially where enforcement was weak. Cocoa farms with child labor and fields where workers were trapped in indentured servitude are just a few horrifying examples linked to ADM's sourcing. This dark side of ADM's growth rarely made headlines. Behind closed doors, executives focused on maximizing profits. Even if it meant ignoring human rights and ethical standards, their influence was so vast that whistleblowers and critics were often silenced or ignored. ADM didn't just grow by meeting demand, they grew by manipulating the very markets they claimed to serve. One of their most notorious strategies was price manipulation. Using their vast market power and insider connections, ADM would quietly influence the prices of essential commodities like corn. This wasn't done in back rooms with a handshake. It happened through carefully timed trades. Strategic supply disruptions. By squeezing farmers and competitors, ADM could control not just what food was produced, but when it hit the market and at what cost. Farmers who refused to play by their rules quickly found themselves priced out, shut out of major distribution networks, or forced to sell their harvest at rock-bottom prices just to stay afloat. They built monopolies that allowed them to corner the market, driving out smaller players who simply couldn't compete with ADM's reach or financial muscle. This wasn't just smart business, it was a deliberate, calculated strategy to control global supply chains and dictate prices. By hoarding massive stockpiles of grains during shortages or flooding markets during harvest season, ADM ensured they always stayed on top, and everyone else stayed beneath them. But their greed extended far beyond just manipulating markets. Beneath the surface of ADM's global empire was an ugly reality. Reports surfaced over the years that ADM heavily relied on exploitative labor practices to keep their costs low and profits high. This included the use of forced labor and even child labor within their supply chains, particularly in remote, impoverished regions where oversight was weak or non-existent. Their influence became so vast, and their political connections so entrenched, that whistleblowers and critics who tried to expose these abuses often found themselves threatened, silenced. And if you thought price fixing and labor abuse was as bad as it got, what ADM did to entire governments will leave you speechless. As ADM grew more powerful, their tactics expanded beyond business. Corruption became a key tool. ADM didn't just manipulate markets, they manipulated governments. Through bribery, lobbying, and political pressure, ADM influenced policies worldwide, especially in countries where they had major operations like Indonesia, Brazil, and Argentina. This political cloud let ADM avoid strict regulations and maintain their monopolies. They secured favorable contracts, and sometimes swayed elections to keep leaders sympathetic to their interests and power. This gave them unprecedented control over entire food systems and economies. Alongside this political influence were scandals involving labor exploitation. ADM's use of child and forced labor became widely reported, but instead of taking responsibility, ADM often dismissed these claims. They paid fines, but the core abuses continued. The company prioritized profit over ethics, betraying the very people who helped build their empire. Farmers were betrayed too. Those depending on ADM for fair market prices found themselves victims of price-fixing conspiracies and manipulative practices. ADM's corporate betrayals were not isolated incidents but part of a systematic effort to maintain power at any cost. And this wasn't happening in the shadows of just one country, it was a global playbook. Wherever ADM planted its flag, the same pattern followed. In Indonesia, environmental restrictions meant to protect rainforests were quietly loosened in ADM's favor. In Brazil, trade laws were rewritten to suit their export demands. In Argentina, subsidies and tax breaks mysteriously appeared just in time to bail them out during market downturns. These weren't coincidences. ADM knew exactly what levers to pull and which pockets to line. They understood that controlling governments was just as important as controlling supply chains, and when politicians couldn't be bought outright, ADM simply turned to influence operations, funding campaigns, sponsoring policies, and deploying armies of lobbyists to shape legislation behind closed doors. And the consequences? Devastating. Entire rural communities dependent on local agriculture found themselves crushed when ADM's market manipulations sent prices plummeting. Farmers who once made a living from their land were driven to bankruptcy. And when those farms collapsed, even laborers working in ADM-linked operations weren't spared. Workers in cocoa fields, sugar plantations, in some cases, outright slavery. Investigative reports detailed children trafficked across borders to work long hours with no pay, while adults faced threats of violence if they tried to leave. Investigative reports detailed children trafficked across borders to work long hours with no pay, while adults faced threats of violence if they tried to leave. When caught, they paid fines so small, it was the cost of doing business, barely a dent in their quarterly profits. And every time the public outrage faded, ADM resumed operations as if nothing had happened. This relentless pattern of betrayal wasn't an accident. It was a carefully engineered strategy designed to keep ADM on top. The company knew that governments could be compromised, watchdog groups could be discredited, and it worked every time. And as shocking as this sounds, trust me, it's about to get worse. Because ADM wasn't just manipulating governments, what they were hiding from the public was even darker. The 1990s dealt a huge blow to ADM's reputation, a massive price-fixing scandal that shook the food industry to its core. ADM was caught red-handed colluding with other major grain traders to artificially inflate global grain prices, manipulating entire markets for their own gain. This wasn't just unethical, it was outright illegal. The fallout was swift and brutal, and it tarnished image in business circles. But for ADM, this wasn't the end. It was just another storm to weather, because if there's one thing ADM knew how to do, it was survive. And as damaging as this scandal was, it turned out to be just the tip of the iceberg. Investigative reports soon pulled back the curtain on something even darker: ADM's ties to forced and child labor in their international supply chains. Cocoa farms in West Africa linked to ADM were found using children as young as 7, forced to work long, dangerous hours in brutal conditions. They carried heavy sacks of cocoa pods. The abuses didn't stop there. Adults working on these farms were trapped in what amounted to indentured servitude. Pay was minimal, living conditions were squalid, and attempts to leave were met with threats, violence, or retaliation. Investigative reports detailed harrowing stories of children trafficked across borders to work long hours with no pay. But ADM always had a fallback plan. When allegations surfaced, they denied. When evidence leaked, they blamed subcontractors and suppliers. Publicly, they promised reforms. Privately, operations carried on, even as human rights organizations sounded the alarm and international watchdog groups demanded action. ADM's response was consistently superficial. They'd pay fines, adjust public-facing policies, and publish carefully worded statements of concern. But little meaningful change ever followed. In most cases, it was business as usual, and the scandals didn't end there. ADM also faced intense scrutiny for their role in environmental destruction. Their aggressive sourcing practices contributed directly to mass deforestation, habitat loss, and irreversible damage to sensitive ecosystems across South America, Southeast Asia, and Africa. Rainforests were leveled to make room for industrial plantations supplying ADM's insatiable demand for commodities like palm oil. Yet, ADM often downplayed their involvement, shifting blame onto local contractors or vague industry practices. And despite mounting evidence and growing environmental protests, the company's core operations continued unhindered. These scandals, as horrific as they were, revealed the true face of ADM's empire, a sprawling corporate machine built on exploitation, corruption, and denial. The pattern was clear: dominate markets, crush competition, exploit labor, and when exposed, denied. Think that was scary? Wait till you watch this. I'll see you there.